I'm based in Stockholm, in Sweden, in the north of Europe, and I work for the largest environmental NGO in Sweden. We have 200,000 members, which is a lot for a country with 10 million people. Yeah, and I work in the international department, so work a lot on trying to kind of push Swedish government officials to look at climate justice in international negotiations and so on. So I will speak a bit about climate finance, and especially related to climate finance under the Paris Agreement. So as many other speakers have talked about, we know that kind of the unjust reality is that the countries that are responsible for the majority of historical emissions are not the ones suffering the worst from the consequences, and also this applies to country level, but also then communities within countries. So I just want to take as an example the ND Gain Index that scores the vulnerability and readiness score to climate change. And this has also been up a lot the past few days. You've been talking about how the natural disasters from climate change, I think someone said that 86% of the days in India over the year there have been natural disasters. So just to compare the score, you can see that Switzerland, a rich country in Europe, scores 1, so it has a very good readiness scores and also very good vulnerability. So it's not very vulnerable to the effects. Whereas country like Somalia in East Africa is at 185. And I also want to compare just Sweden, where I'm from, and India. So Sweden has a number 10, so also very low score, whereas India has 138. I think this index is quite interesting because I think the readiness, of course, vulnerability also has to do with geographically where you're placed, but then the readiness score, it's also related to countries have been able to for 100 years or more build quite strong economies, and then they're more have more capacity to deal with the effects of climate change as well. So I guess this kind of set the state or the context for why we have climate finance within the negotiations. And it's also, I mean, this injustice has been known for a long time, and it's, I guess, they're trying to deal with it through then this common but different responsibility and respective capabilities under the UNFCCC, and also this in the Paris Agreement that developed country parties shall provide financial resources to assist developing country parties with respect to both mitigation and adaptation. And we also saw in the latest synthesis report of the IPCC that they also kind of stated that climate justice, equity, and social justice in climate action allows for more sustainable outcomes. So I think this is really also coming to the table that we need a just approach to actually succeed within climate action. So if we look at climate finance, this was also up yesterday. So rich countries, or global north, has pledged to provide $100 billion annually in new and additional climate finance up until 2025. These numbers are quite old in the graphs. I don't know if you can see, they go up to 2020, but this has not been met yet. It's estimated to have been met during 2023, but we haven't seen the figures yet. So there has been many issues with this pledge, except for not being able to meet the target in the actual sum. We also know that major share, the largest share is given through loans, which then put countries that already are in, many that already are in debt crisis, even further debt crisis, which also kind of drives climate change, because it means that countries may continue to, use fossil fuels to boost their industries and for exports, and also engage in deforestation. There's also a problem with transparency in this system, and very important that the finance does not meet the most affected and vulnerable groups or local communities, so who benefits. And there's been a really skewed balance between mitigation and adaptation finance, where a higher share has gone to mitigation activities rather than adaptation. I think this can also be linked to much being from loans, because I think, of course, the return on investment is more safe on mitigation activities rather than adaptation activities. I think that's quite clear. And also, if we look at the channels, we see that it's mostly represented by then multilateral banks and our channels. So like the World Bank, for example. We also have bilateral. There's a share of private finance and there's a share of export credits. And another aspect is that, so when the countries pledge to provide new and additional, this should be interpreted, we believe, as additional to already pledged aid. So, ODA, it's called, so aid that goes to other development activities in the Global South. But this is usually not the case, so that means that climate finance kind of competes with aid. And that's also one of the reasons why this pledge hasn't been met, because there's no new money coming in. So at COP28, it was decided that the Fund for Loss and Damage should be operationalized. And this is then, you could see as a kind of the third leg of where climate finance is needed. So we need finance for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And this has been pushed through by civil societies for many, many years. And it will be hosted under the World Bank. And at COP29, and this was also mentioned yesterday, the next climate target will be decided. And it's set to have a floor of what it is today, so $100 billion US. But there's a really big push from decision makers and in the global north to have more additional private finance coming in and other innovative sources, so not having to kind of step up the public funding. And there has been then also this kind of push for the multilateral development banks to take on a larger role in channeling this money. And I think all of this also needs to be, not all of it, but it has also to be seen in the kind of political reality that we live in now. Like if you look at the political winds going through Europe, for example, where I'm based, you can see that a lot of right-wing and kind of conservative governments are gaining power, unfortunately, with less appetite for providing aid, even less appetite for mitigating climate change. And then you also have, the war in Ukraine that has affected the landscape and increased military spending. This was also up yesterday. And so it's kind of, we were all glad that, COP28 could happen in Dubai and so on, despite all these different wars going on. But I think, the reality now is that it's a tricky situation, and then we have the election coming up in the US, and that's also important. Many elections this year, you have an election here as well. So, I mean, using the democratic vote is important. And then just so, as I mentioned, the multilateral development banks have been kind of given or asked to take on a bigger role, and a lot of climate finance is channeled through the World Bank. So the World Bank is a dominant player and has a lot of power. And this is problematic. And why is that? Many different reasons. And I think a lot of you in here could also share your insights in this. But in its architecture, it's a bank with shareholders from the global north. So they have a lot of power and say. And shareholders that also want return on investments. And it has historically supported extractive economies, where fossil fuel projects has been seen as a way for economic growth. And there's also seems to be kind of, the bank wants to be a climate leader, but when you see how they actually, what type of projects they support and policy advice they provide, it's not really, what it looks like. They still see gas as a transition fuel. It's also a transition fuel in the text from Dubai, the COP there. So that's problematic, because this is, I think, a really important aspect of this is that they're not really engaging with communities. So it's also like, who are these gas projects for? Who do they benefit? Well, the governments, but not the people. And this is also comes back to the large-scale top-down projects rather than bottom-up and decentralized solutions. And then the bank, we also see now they've remade their strategy, the evolution roadmap, so they're trying to kind of change their operational model. And we see that there's been, they're trying to tackle climate change more, which is clear and good, but there's a lot of focus on the cascade approach, so how to, get private money in and private financing, which, of course, more financing is good, but there's a risk that kind of the belief in that this is going to, private finance can solve the problem. Because that the financial system that we've had up until today, or that we have today, has also created the type of inequalities that we see in the world. So, the whole financial architecture basically needs to change. I'm not an expert in that, but I mean it's pretty clear. So then the risk is that private financial interest will be prioritized over public interest for environment, climate change, human rights, and other social aims. Also, what we see is that private finance could work for mitigation projects. Coming back to that again, but it's very unclear how private, the appetite from investors to invest in adaptation and more so loss and damage. So yeah, there's more risk here that more we go to mitigation activities rather than adaptation, loss and damage, and then also reach the most vulnerable communities. So now I'm going to talk a bit about Article 6, which has to do with carbon markets under the Paris Agreement. I think this also relates to how to get in private finance and how to find finance solutions for mitigation activities. This is, there are many similarities to the Kyoto Protocol. And the idea behind it is to mobilize finance and increase climate action. This is under the Paris Agreement, and it has been really tricky to move forward with the negotiations, and it's not done, or it's not ready yet to be used. This is highly supported by the MDBs, such as World Bank, and many countries as well. So there are 3 parts of Article 6. There's the bilateral part, so this means that 2 countries agree. So for example, Sweden agrees with Ghana to invest in a solar project there, and then there's a bilateral agreement. Then you have 6.4, which deals more with how to create a global market that can be governed under the UNFCCC. So this is also where you, like the ones operating at the voluntary carbon market today could come in and make money from that. Maybe you've heard of blue carbon. Yeah. And then there's 6.8, which are more non-market-based collaborations to finance kind of nature solutions. Maybe this could be used for climate finance. It's unclear. So, yeah, as you can see here as well, not finalized, not operational. So it's not finalized yet. However, countries are going ahead with the bilateral. So we already have Switzerland and Thailand have made a deal. Sweden and Ghana have started. And because countries are already starting with this will make the negotiations more tricky because countries are starting without there being, clear how this is going to be governed or how the process is going to happen, how environmental and social safeguards are, going to be protected. So the graph here, I don't know if you can see, but so the idea is that, the host country, which would be Thailand, and then you have the acquiring country, which would be Switzerland. So the host country has a number of activities they can do to meet their NDC targets or their climate mitigation target as pledged under the Paris Agreement. And if they then know that they can increase it more than they have pledged to, then the acquiring country, Switzerland, can invest. This could be through technology transfer, direct investments, or capacity building activities. And then Switzerland will acquire the emission reduction and can calculate this to their climate target, whereas the host country, Thailand, gets the benefit of the investments, basically. And I just wanted to kind of raise something about India. So from what I know, Sweden and India made this deal at COP28, Lead It 2.0, which is focused on the transition of the industry. So also want to add here, a lot of countries that have come quite far in the development of green technology see huge opportunities with the transition and how they can make money and export their technology. And this is where Article 6 becomes also really good, not just to acquire emission reductions, but also to be able to export your technology. And under this Lead It, so I think there will be a session on steel after this one. So I know that steel will be big, because Sweden is also a big steel producer, green steel, and so on. So my understanding is that there's hope that this partnership can then lead to Article 6 projects. Maybe you know more about the status in India there, but I think there needs to be some updates on the Indian NDC to be able to use it. Okay, so some of the risk is, does it lead to mitigation outcomes? The rule book that exists today, there's really low transparency. How to calculate, talked about the emission calculations earlier, the uncertainty relating to this, the additionality of the project, would this happen anyway? Negative environmental and social impacts, and that it becomes more expensive for the host country to reduce its own emissions and meet the targets in the NDC. Carbon markets, I won't go into that then, but it's highly problematic. So I'm just also, this is the last slide, so just to mention, how do we see it? Yeah, so there are also other ways. When we talk about innovative finance, I think there's a need to be innovative. So there was a Danish study here that looked at how can we find, so for example, wealth tax, air transport tax, different types of taxes that could be used to acquire climate finance or climate aid. And also of large corporations to take responsibility for historical climate debt would be one way. And it's not only a question of the sum, it's very much a question of what type of projects. Does it reach people on the ground, communities, and so on? So we don't repeat, as also been mentioned many times, so we don't repeat the same problems that we've had with fossil fuel projects, but we just change them to renewable. So we need a just transition, not just a transition. Thanks.